everyone, and welcome back to Neuropsych. So in the last video, we went over an introduction of our motor system. So we talked about the motor, premotor, and supplementary motor cortex. And we talked about these four regions that are necessary for skilled movements that are located in the neocortex. And we also talked about the motor homunculus and an example of a simple motor movement like grasping a cup of coffee and what pathways are all involved in that. So in this video, we are going to talk about the three types of organization in the motor cortex. We're going to talk about the premotor cortex versus the primary motor cortex. We're going to talk about dual channels for reaching, the movement lexicon, premotor control, and mirroring movement. So motor cortex is a specialized cortex, which is important for the control of movements. So it does not control individual muscles, but it controls certain movements and then tells the spinal cord what these certain muscles have to do. So many different muscles are needed for any given movement, and the more complex a movement is, the more muscles are active, which makes sense, right? If you're dancing, you need more muscles than if you're simply just grasping a cup of coffee. So there are three types of organization in the motor cortex. So the first one is to think about what parts of the body you need to move. So if you're just grabbing a cup of coffee, you will need to move your hand and move your fingers to grasp the cup. Whereas if you want to kick a soccer ball, you have to use your legs and your balance and kick forward. So the second one is the spatial location to which the movement is directed. And the third one is the function of the movement. Do you want to push something? Do you want to hold something? Do you want to move your body somewhere? So each part of the cortex is responsible for different movements. Complex and whole body movements are represented in the premotor cortex, as we talked about, which is right before the primary motor cortex. And more discrete or more simple movements are represented in the primary motor cortex, which is right here in the precentral gyrus. So let's look at an example. So here you see movement categories that are evoked by electrical stimulation of the cortex in a monkey, and this was done in a study. So in blue, right here, you see the primary motor cortex, and in purple, right here, you see the premotor cortex in the monkey, and in green, you see the prefrontal cortex in the monkey. So stimulating the primary motor cortex, as you can see right here, will evoke simple motor movements such as sticking out the tongue or lowering the hand in space or pressing the hand forward, as you can see by all these little pictures of this monkey. So these movements are very simple and they're not complex and lack flexibility. However, when they stimulated the premotor cortex, it evoked more complex movements. So examples of more complex movements, what they saw is defense mechanism, where you can see all the facial muscles need to be moved, and hands, sometimes legs are moved, or climbing and leaping postures. So they would jump up and down or grasp onto something they could hold on to. And also, for example, reaching to grasp something. So this is different from this one because right here they're not just moving their arm, but they also have to move their fingers so they can hold on to something. So multiple movements are technically happening at once. So for example, the hand-to-mouth movements, the fingers move closer together and a thumb will eventually position against the forefinger. So this is whenever a monkey wants to grab something. And then the arm also needs to be tuned upward, right? So these are a little bit more complex than just simply putting your arm up or down in space. So what I want you to take home from this slide is that the primary motor cortex is necessary for simple movements, and you need also your premotor cortex for more difficult movements where you need to plan ahead. So the motor cortex is not the only region from which movements can be evoked, and we talked about this a little bit in the previous video. So similar functional movements can be elicited by electrically stimulating the parietal cortex. So we talked about that, and we went over some anatomical pictures. So the parietal topography technically mirrors the motor homunculus. So it is similarly organized. So it's also upside down, so where the face is represented on the more ventral side, and on the more dorsal side you have the feet. So stepping movements are elicited from more dorsal parietal regions, and reaching movements are elicited from more medial parietal regions, and then hand or mouth movements are elicited from more ventral parietal regions. So how do the motor cortex and the corresponding parietal cortex topographical regions produce movements? Okay, so let's go over an example for reaching for a food item. To perform a reaching movement, your visual, somatosensory, and sometimes even your auditory information about that target must be sent to the motor cortex before even making a movement. So to guide reaching to a target, the visual cortex has to identify both the location of the object and the object itself. Based on the information about that object location, the visual cortex instructs the parietal arm region about these objects or the locations, and then the hand region about how to shape the fingers to grasp this object. So these parietal regions represent the sensory receptors on the body that will be activated when the object is contacted. So the reach and grasp regions of the parietal cortex then connect to reach and grasp regions on the motor cortex, and then that's when a movement will be produced, and it will be sent to the spinal cord and sent to the muscles, so your arm will start moving. So there are many different combinations of how activity in parietal cortex to motor cortex create complex movements. So the key is that each cortical motor region makes a different contribution to movement. The visual cortex identified the spatial location of the target and also its shape. And the parietal cortex identified the body part that will need to contact the object. And then the motor cortex represents the elements needed to move the arm towards the target and to make your hand create this shape to be able to grab it. Okay, so humans actually have something like a lexicon or kind of like a repertoire of movements categories in the cortex. For example, most people reaching for a small object will use variations of what we call the pincer grip, as you can see right here. So we use our thumb and any other finger, most often this finger, to grab something that's small. So when a healthy baby is around 3 months of age, they can begin to spontaneously use the pincer grip when making spontaneous hand and finger movements. So they'll start to grab little stones or breadcrumbs, and then by around 12 months, they begin to pick up tiny objects using this grip. And then eventually by 4 years of age, they can make movements pretty precise using their visual guidance. So they can actually look at something and using their visual guidance, they can try to pick it up. So other evidence that support that we have a movement lexicon in the cortex is that primate species use the same grip patterns, and people who have incurred small lesions of the motor cortex around the thumb region of the homunculus have weakness in the thumb and also other fingers and also in their arm. So this pincer grip is not entirely learned, but are part of our motor vocabulary and technically are pre-wired movements in our lexicon. So findings from lesion studies suggest that the premotor cortex and the primary motor cortex share a common movement lexicon. So the repertoire available to the premotor cortex is way more complex than the primary cortex, hence why the premotor cortex can organize more complex movements. So if you remember from a couple slides back, and I showed this picture, the premotor cortex is involved in more complex movements that need a lot of planning, whereas the primary motor cortex alone can do simple movements such as hand to mouth or pushing the hand forward in space. So findings from another lesion study suggest that the premotor cortex has a more complex repertoire compared to the primary motor cortex. So damage to the premotor cortex does not produce muscle weakness, but it does disrupt more complex movements. So let's take a look at this picture. So this is a study done. So on a task where both hands are required, a healthy monkey can easily push a peanut through the hole and then catch it with the other hand. So this is not see-through, this is just for illustration purposes. But if the premotor cortex has a lesion, the brain injured monkey cannot do that. He will push it through, but he will not be able to catch it with the other hand. So he will not be able to coordinate this movement. This means that the premotor cortex is needed for these complex movements. So our movements are technically anything but robotic. So our actions are learned, our situations are specific, and often it depends upon our interactions with other people, how we move. So a really cool study using single unit electrode recordings in monkeys showed that a subset of neurons in the ventral premotor area discharge not only when the monkey itself makes a movement, but it will also discharge in a similar way when this monkey sees other monkeys do the exact same movement, and even when it sees people make the movement. So these neurons that fire are called mirror system neurons. So mirror system neurons, they encode the goal of an action. They do not respond to objects or to isolated hand movements, and they also do not respond very well to pictures or videos. So whenever they see someone do something, they will fire in a specific way, and it will be similar of when they do that specific movement. So some of these mirror neurons are very specific, and some react to a more broad and continuous movement. So the flexible properties of mirror neurons underlie our ability to imagine movements. So these neurons can fill in the blanks when a part of the movement is absent. The ability of these mirror neurons to participate in self-action and as well in perceiving others' action technically suggests that they form the same neural substrate of self-awareness, social awareness, and awareness of intentions of others. So studies have also suggested that symptoms of some disorders are related to these mirror neuron systems. So for example, the absence of empathy, which sometimes occurs in some cases on the autism spectrum disorder, and there might be a relation between the absence of empathy here and these mirror neuron system dysfunctions. Okay, so that was the end of this video, and I will see you guys back soon for the next video.